When I was a young child, I don't remember what age I was, but we were living in New Jersey, so I must have been around 5 or 6 years old. And my dad woke me up in the middle of the night, and he said, "Come with me." And I was really groggy. I remember my dad got me in the car. He said, "I have a surprise for you." And he drove me a while, and we drove to this field. And we got out of the car, and I kept saying, "Dad, what time is it?" And he kept saying, "It's the middle of the night." He didn't say what they said. It's the middle of the night. And there were all these people in this field, several dozen. And my dad brought a picnic blanket, and he put the blanket out on this grassy knoll, and we laid on the blanket, and we looked up at the sky. There was this fantastic meteor shower, like the Perseus meteor shower that we have sometimes. And I just remember looking up at the sky, and every 15 to 20 seconds, there was a fantastic of light across the sky. And I think that was my first introduction to the world beyond the earth. That probably first impregnated me with wanting to tell stories not of this world.
With his interest in the cosmos sparked by the meteor shower event, Steven Spielberg obtained a telescope and began taking an interest in astronomy. His father was a science fiction fan who read a lot of books and magazines, and young Steven would often borrow his father's periodicals to study. By the age of 16 years old in 1962, Steven never missed an episode of Twilight Zone, and he was well versed in such films as The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Forbidden Planet, and any other film he could see, since he himself was already making his own movies with fellow friends and cast members in Phoenix, Arizona. Because he was into science fiction, he was also interested in flying saucers. And one night, his Boy Scout group was camping in the desert, and they saw a brilliant red light rise up from the desert and proceeded to fly off into the sky. Steven was really upset he missed the event, and in his frustration, he began writing a 67-page screenplay called Firelight. The story was about a group of scientists who investigate disappearances in a small town after 3 balls of light descended on the locale. They discover a group of bad aliens are responsible and kidnap the people to put them in a zoo. Up to this time, Steven had made many home movies and even won awards for short films as a teen. However, Firelight was something different. Steven wanted to make a feature. At 17 years old, in June 1963, Steven and his father amassed $600 and put it towards his new production with the support of friends, classmates, and family. The movie began filming under Steven's first amateur movie company called American Artists Productions. After 6 months of making the film, he cut it down to 135 minutes long, and through a family friend, the film premiered at the Phoenix Little Theater in March 1964, and Spielberg launched into a publicity campaign to promote it. Steven tasted his first success when the screening sold out thanks to the publicity campaign, and the movie made $800, thus making a profit for Steven. When Steven was interviewed by a newspaper for the premiere, he stated, "I hope to interest Universal in producing a big screen remake of the 8mm epic." Little did anyone know at the time that he was germinating Close Encounters of the Third Kind. His victory was short-lived when his family suddenly moved to California. He would be an unknown senior in Saratoga High, where he felt alone and ostracized. Within a short time, his parents would talk divorce, and Steven felt pressure because his father didn't like the grades he was getting and wanted Steven to move away from his filmmaking hobby to assert himself in the real-world job market that involved a college degree. When the inevitable divorce came, Steven ended up going to live with his father in Los Angeles after graduating high school. This move would put him close to his dream of working in Hollywood. He applied to the University of Southern California, but was denied due to his poor grades. With the draft looming for Vietnam, and to appease his father, he ended up attending the California State University at Long Beach. The odds of Stephen landing a Hollywood studio job were almost non-existent. During the 60s, studios were overstaffed and mostly filled with middle-aged dinosaurs of the industry. Young people were not hired for their talents in filmmaking. They were hired for their physical labor and acting. Yet to Stephen's luck or fate, whatever you want to believe, Hollywood was changing. In most cases, the younger audience didn't want westerns and musicals anymore, nor did they want big-budget epics that lasted over 3 hours. The studios needed to change. Enter Easy Rider in 1969, about two bikers on a round trip involving drugs and free love, with a dark fate looming. The film was a monumental success fueled by young audiences, and Hollywood suddenly realized that their outlook towards their audience needed to change. Hollywood started looking for new perspectives that attracted audiences rather than repulsed them, and take faith that this will occur as well in modern times. But in the late 60s and early 70s, they began hiring directors like Robert Altman, William Friedkin, Dennis Hopper, and Francis Ford Coppola, to name a few. But Spielberg wasn't like those new talented people. He had no academic ties to Hollywood or a degree, but he did have one friend named Chuck Silvers, who was an editorial supervisor who worked at Universal Studios. When Stephen was in high school, he gave him a tour of the studio thanks to family ties, and Stephen showed him his Firelight film. Stephen was passionate about film, and Chuck knew he had talent. It was through Chuck that Stephen got an unpaid internship as a clerical assistant in the editorial department, and it allowed Stephen to explore Universal Studios from the inside, and he learned everything he could. He was so enthusiastic, he would sleep in the offices often and would make contacts left and right within the halls of the studio. From there, he worked his way to making a musical film for the band October Country called Amblin that got him recognition for his filming style and his technical skill. Studio executive Sidney Sheinberg offered Stephen $275 a week to direct television projects. Stephen dropped out of college and went for it. By 1971, Steven Spielberg gained strong attention with the release of his film Duel, and from that came his first Hollywood film deal, Sugarland Express. While filming Sugarland Express, Stephen worked with two writers named Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, who wrote the film. Stephen was well versed in UFOs, as he never abandoned his interest in the field, and discovered that Hal and Matthew had their own idea for a UFO story in mind about a police officer from the South who investigates a disturbance at a farmhouse and has a close encounter with a UFO. After reporting it, he is ridiculed, and even his own family doesn't believe him. Obsessed, the man joins a UFO group, and when the aliens return, he leaves the planet with them. Stephen had a lot of ideas about a UFO movie in the early 70s, which included a couple seeing a UFO, or he thought he might make a documentary about UFOs. After reading Dr. J. Allen Hynek's book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Spielberg began drafting ideas that mirrored Hynek's. It was to be a thriller about a Project Blue Book agent whose job it was to debunk claims of UFO encounters. The agent would soon encounter a real UFO and aliens and realized that the government's true aim is to cover up the truth. The agent would do his best to expose the conspiracy before the aliens would land, and the film would end with humans and extraterrestrials having formal contact. The treatment was called Watch the Skies and was registered with the Writing Guild of America. Spielberg was set to direct the movie, but another project caught his attention, and it was a movie called Jaws. After the director dropped out for Jaws, Stephen was considered as director for the film. While the script of Jaws was being rewritten by Howard Sackler, Stephen was nervous about the fate of this film. He thought it might not happen. So, on his free time, he tweaked the idea of Watch the Skies. While playing poker with Alan Ladd Jr., Stephen pitched his political thriller Watch the Skies. aliens. Ladd liked the idea, and he wanted to do business with Stephen, but he only had television movies under his belt, and Sugarland Express had not been released yet. Stephen needed more credibility to make such a film. Stephen was friends with a couple that were currently producing a film called The Sting, and they were Julia and Michael Phillips. He would attend their social gatherings at their house on the beach, and at such events, Stephen would meet lifelong friends like Brian De Palma and Martin Scorsese. Since he was currently shopping for producers, it made sense to him to approach Julia and Michael, especially since they were his friends. And Michael happened to love science fiction like Stephen. The producers backed him, and the trio had an official meeting with Alan Ladd Jr., who was already keen to the idea, but now that producers were backing the deal, it looked more sellable. Ladd approved the idea to develop a screenplay. Spielberg turned to his team on Sugarland Express, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins. The writing team thought Stephen was a good sell and pitched their idea about the cop encountering a UFO at a farmhouse and being maligned by everyone until he leaves the planet with the aliens at the end. Stephen liked their idea but wanted to go with his Project Blue Book route. The writing team passed because they wanted their vision and were close to directing it, but Universal Studios dropped their take and the budget came out over $7 million. Stephen's producer couple was currently working with a writer named Paul Schrader, who was working on another project for them called Taxi Driver. After talking about it, Paul suggested the Blue Book agent should be a skeptic that doesn't believe in UFOs until he sees one, and it turns his life upside down, and by the end of the film, he would search for the truth until he would enter the ship willingly and leave the Earth with the aliens. When they proposed Paul as their writer, Ladd didn't like the idea of paying $35,000 for Schrader to write the film, as it was too expensive already, and when Julia and Michael insisted, Ladd backed away from the project. After these events, the script for Jaws was now done by Sackler, and with Watch the Skies on hold, Spielberg put more focus on Jaws. While Stephen worked on post-production for Jaws, his producing couple would propose Watch the Skies to the financially strapped Columbia Pictures, whose new studio head was Julia's old boss, David Begelman. A meeting occurred, and Begelman showed immediate interest because he knew Julia well, and The Sting was a hit waiting to arrive at theaters. He also loved Stephen's duel as well, and he liked the idea of Schrader being the writer. It was a great package, but there was one thing that was bothering Begelman. How much was this going to cost? No one discussed the budget because they were shopping around for interest. However, Stephen immediately said $2.8 million. Nobody believed that was possible because the film was ambitious and such a low budget couldn't realize that. Still, no one argued it during the meeting. Begelman, impressed, approved the film, and a deal was made to finance the script. If it went well, they would make the movie. Stephen would later be questioned by Julia and Michael why he said $2.8 million. It was the highest number that Begelman would listen to without objecting. With that, Stephen went to make Jaws while Julia and Michael focused on Taxi Driver. Paul Schrader's first draft was called Kingdom Come, and this was his version. Major Paul Van Owen is a Project Blue Book agent who travels the country dismissing or debunking UFO sightings. One night, while driving, he encounters a real UFO and he reports it and is ridiculed within his own agency and friends. As his marriage falls apart, he threatens the head of Project Blue Book to expose the cover-up, and in an effort to silence him, the head of Blue Book suggests he join Project Grief, which is an organization that goes to extreme lengths to keep the public from finding out about the crafts. While not doing that, they spend the majority of their time trying to contact the aliens in an attempt to foster a dialogue. With no marriage and no love for dismissing other claims, he says yes. For 15 years, Van Owen spends his time in Project Grief, but manifestations from the memories that aliens implanted in mankind's collective consciousness millions of years ago. Yes, the scriptwriter who wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull came up with this schlock, and he was paid $35,000 for it. Anyways, Van Owen takes a spiritual journey into his abstract subconscious and finds the alien memory, and he realizes that it's a message to rendezvous with the alien at Idaho's Black Mountain. He travels there and meets up with the Happy Greys, who then offer him a ride on their mothership, and he leaves the Earth behind with his new buds. Stephen hated this script, and so did Michael and Julia. Writer Paul Schrader said it best, since writers are usually their worst critics. It had little to do with the UFO phenomenon, and nothing to do with the movie I wanted to make. It was horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. Worried that they might lose the deal with Columbia, Julia did not show the script to David Bagelman. Of course, Schrader left the project, leaving the film in jeopardy. The two producers began looking for another writing option. The good news was The Sting was a huge success with Academy Awards, and Sugarland Express also arrived in theaters. Stephen's name was growing, and off he went to work on Jaws. While Stephen was filming Jaws on July 19, 1974, John Hill was approached by Julia to write the newly retitled Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He had done some television and would soon be known for the weird heart beeps and the wonderful Quigley Down Under with Tom Selleck. However, he was relatively new in 1975, and he was best of all cheap. After getting the job, Hill went to his job at an ad agency and quit. I kept expecting the two producers or the studio to have me get started writing right away, but they kept deferring to the fact that Steven Spielberg had the idea more in his head than anyone's. So let's wait and meet with him. So Hill studied J. Allen Hynek, the UFO phenomenon, and after a month went by in August 1974, producers Michael and Julia flew to Martha's Vineyard with John Hill to meet with Stephen, who was slogging away on Jaws. They went to his cabin for a weekend get-together and waited and waited and waited, while Stephen was out to sea trying to get his shark working. To pass time waiting for Stephen to show up, Hill would play Pong with Richard Dreyfuss a lot. The meeting happened on a Saturday, and the film was discussed along with Steven Spielberg's changes. The story continued to be about the debunker for Blue Book that kind of bullied people into not reporting, and then he sees a UFO for real. He wants to report it on record, and when he does, he is shut out of the program. He realizes he was part of a cover-up, and he begins having nightmares that always involve a mountain image in his mind. Obsessed, he tries recreating the image in everything he sees, and it scares away his family. He is really cracking up until he sees the image of the mountain on the TV after a proposed nerve gas train derailment. Our main character then rushes out to prove the Air Force is lying. He sneaks to the area and finds the secret base where contact with real aliens occur. After the first meeting, Stephen returned to film some more scenes, and Michael went with him. At the time, the concepts didn't fully gel with Hill, and he approached Julia with some concerns. I had been a science fiction fan all of my life, and I explained to Julia, probably patronizingly, how mixing ESP and UFO was not a good idea at all. I said the first rule of good science fiction is that you ask the reader or audience to accept one fantastical plot premise, but everything else, including human behavior, then has to be real. I said you just can't mix witchcraft and Bigfoot, or the Loch Ness Monster and time travel, or UFOs and ESP. Then, further digging myself into this hole, I cringe at remembering, I said I had just spent almost 5 years in advertising, and you don't want to go out with a blind title. No one knows what it means until after they buy the product. And a clumsy title like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, quite obviously, I explained to Julia Phillips, who humored me in a nice way, that title was not memorable, didn't communicate anything to the average moviegoer. On Sunday, it was officially an off day for the Jaws crew, and it was traditional for Stephen and the Jaws crew to play a local team at softball, and Hill was frustrated that Stephen didn't clear that day to work with him. Stephen, after all, was working 16-hour days, 6 days a week on Jaws, and therefore took his one day off very seriously. Hill was sent back to LA, and he started working that week. Hill would continue to communicate with the producers about his progress, and during one meeting with Julia, he got to witness more than he wanted to. Julia was a brash person. She said what she meant, often with language that John Landis called satanic. She was also blunt and very quick to anger, and when she got angry, she let people know it around her. She was also very lewd, not only in her humor, but her actions, and on this occasion, when Hill arrived, Julia wanted him to have a script meeting with her while she was sunbathing topless. Hill insisted, much to Julia's annoyance, that she get dressed before they work. These kinds of shenanigans and lack of self-restraint would no doubt contribute to a looming divorce and cause more problems, as you will soon see. In November 1974, John Hill turned in a script for Meeting of the Minds, not Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but there was a bigger problem besides the title. Richard Nixon resigned 3 months ago, and Vietnam ended, and Steven and the producers thought audiences like themselves would be turned off by a movie about more government cover-ups and lies. So they decided to start from scratch story-wise. Soon after, John Hill got the phone call from Michael Phillips. "John, you did the assignment and took us down the road we said, but that has let us see clearly now. That is not the direction we want to go. So thank you for helping us in that way. You're a really good writer. You know I'm a fan, but we're taking you off the project now, so we can go in a new direction with a fresh writer." And that was that. I got paid by the studio for later drafts no one ever wanted, and I was off the project. And life moved on, and years later, when the beautiful mothership rose into the night sky and cinematic history, I was left behind, a footnote. In early 1975, Spielberg was nervous. He was deep into post-production for Jaws and feared for his future. Rumors were swirling around Hollywood about Jaws issues, and Stephen thought if he didn't get another gig quick, if Jaws flopped, he might not ever get another directing job again. So he felt compelled to get a directing job before Jaws came out. With Close Encounters in limbo, he entertained ideas. He was considered for Mario Puzo's Superman, but Alexander Salkind wasn't convinced that Steven was right for it and insisted that they wait to see Jaws first. Then, he was about to do producer Rob Cohen's The Bingo Long-Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings, which was a Depression-era comedy drama about a baseball team tired of being treated like slaves. Stephen was hired by Cohen to direct it, but no contract was made. Stephen even hired Joe Alves to research the subject matter and begin researching the time period, as Stephen's hands were full with Jaws. Whenever they worked together, Stephen told him about Close Encounters, and Alves would state, "Boy, that sounds a lot more interesting than this baseball thing. Maybe you should do that." After talking with Alves more, Stephen recanted, leaving Close Encounters. He left the baseball film, which would later be directed by John Badham, and starred Billy D. Williams, James Earl Jones, and Richard Pryor. Spielberg decided he had to step up to the plate. This was the movie he wanted to remake since he was a teenager, and he wanted it to be more personal and filled with wonder. He knew he had to write the script himself. A deal was made with Columbia to write the film, but the studio warned Stephen to keep budget in mind, as the studio had little to spare, and banks were wary of the studio's big-budget ventures. In his first draft, the organization chasing the UFOs was experts operating under the UN and were positive in nature rather than oppressive. The main character of this script was named Norman Greenhouse. He is married to a wife that doesn't understand him and kids who don't listen to him. Norman is a power company trouble foreman who ventures out during a blackout and encounters a UFO. During the second act, Norman is obsessed with an image of a mountain in his mind, and his family just isn't up for it. When Norman builds a massive model of the mountain in his living room, his family leaves him. Breaking down, he sees the true representation on the television and heads there despite the warning of danger, and sneaks to the dark side of the mountain to discover where first contact will occur. In the skies above, UFOs would make it appear constellations were changing by moving around and stopping, and Norman would stare up into the skies with tears in his eyes. To communicate, the aliens would use music, and Spielberg spoke to John Williams about it, who had just worked on Jaws. Spielberg knew the composer would be utilized for this film and went to him early on to make sure he could secure him. The aliens would be gentle and peaceful, wanting communication. I was always a strong advocate of that. If they are smart enough to get here, they're advanced. They're not coming here to conquer us. Stephen even reached out to Hal Barwood while writing and told him about his idea and mentioned that he wanted the protagonist to leave Earth as his family rejected him, and he has nothing left to anchor him to Earth. Since Barwood and Robbins never wrote an official script, their plans to make a UFO film fell apart. Barwood stated that he was glad that Stephen's movie got made and that these ideas got expressed as well as they did. Once Stephen decided to make the protagonist go with the aliens at the end, there was the question of who would witness the tale, and that person became a new character called Jillian Guyler, who would take pictures and be a fellow believer called to the mountain. The first person Stephen hired was Joe Alves. The two worked on mountain prospects in Stephen's office at Universal. On June 20th, 1975, the day Jaws opened, Joe left the studio to search for the inevitable site the final act of the film would take place at, and that was Devil's Mountain. When Jaws premiered, it was a monster, and if you don't know about that film's struggle, we covered it in previous videos. So if you like what we're doing with this one, check that out too. Spielberg was immediately the hottest director in town. Alexander Salkind came out of the woodworks and offered him Superman, and Universal came to him about Jaws 2, which we also covered on this channel. But Spielberg now knew he had the power to make Close Encounters the movie he dreamed of. In August 1975, Stephen finished his script. As the script begins, a town in Indiana loses its power, and Norman Greenhouse is sent out to investigate. He discovers lines have actually been stolen by someone. While driving, his car shuts off and he encounters a UFO. Over his radio, he hears that police are chasing strange lights. He finds the area the police describe and sees the alien craft to witness them fly off into the skies above. It is after this scene that the air traffic control detects several unidentified objects on their screens, and two planes discuss what they see but will not report a UFO. The pilots state some of their passengers have taken pictures. They are ordered to land immediately. Agents meet the plane on the tarmac, and they confiscate camera or tape recorders, stating that the government was testing classified material in the area, and for security's sake they must remove any photos of said experiments. They also state they will return the cameras afterwards. We then cut to Norman sitting in a field crying in wonder as morning approaches. In the clouds above, you can see UFO lights. Jets fly in and the lights suddenly disappear, all but one. The jets try to chase the remaining UFO, and it does amazing feats of movement before disappearing. It is then that Norman returns home. Norman's home life is not great. His wife Ronnie is consumed by her suburban existence and can't even comprehend anything beyond normalcy. And when he heads to an Air Force base to report what he saw, he is treated like a nut job. Determined to show proof, he returns to where he saw the UFOs, but comes away empty-handed. Soon, Norman breaks down, consumed by what he experienced, and he is plagued by the vision of Devil's Tower. He sees it everywhere and builds a copy of his vision in the family room of his house. Unable to support his delusions, Ronnie leaves him. Alone and dejected, Norman watches television and sees Devil's Tower, which is the site of a nerve gas leak in Wyoming. Ignoring the danger, he heads straight for Wyoming, knowing he belongs there. He tries to sneak into the quarantine zone and is captured by men in containment suits. The man who confiscated the camera in the earlier plane scene returns to interrogate Norman, and he introduces himself as Robert Lacombe, leader of the team investigating the UFO phenomenon. Lacombe seems genuinely interested in Norman, but a military commander insists that Norman be flown out with the others. Norman is taken to a helicopter where other believers who ventured into the danger zone are boarded. In this version, everyone in the helicopter runs for the mountain. Many are captured, but Norman, a young woman named Gillian, and an Irish man named Colin O'Connor get away. Lacombe argues with the military that the civilians who came into the quarantine zone should stay, but the military brushes him off. Norman and Gillian make it to the other side of the mountain, escaping knockout gas, but the Irishmen failed to get away. UFOs begin to appear at a landing zone that Gillian and Norman discover. Above, UFOs move around the night sky, seemingly appearing as constellations, then changing shapes. Lacombe tells the synthesizers to attempt communication with atonal notes, and the UFOs respond. Norman makes it to the ground after the mothership lands, and Lacombe notices him. He asks Norman what he wants, and he replies that he wants to know it's real. Above, Gillian observes as Norman is included with the candidates to go off-world with the aliens. 100 aliens disembark from the mothership, and they are very happy, trying to communicate, touching objects, and investigating. Norman is then led on to the mothership while Gillian takes pictures as the theme song for When You Wish Upon a Star plays as the ship flies away. Stephen, Julia, and Michael turned in the script to Columbia, and the studio realized the film would be around $4.5 million to make. Although it was a little too much, Jaws was destroying the box office, and the studio believed Steven Spielberg would be a messiah for their studio to get them firmly solvent again. So, hoping in that, they went ahead. During banking debates and studio politics with contracts after financial approval, Steven Spielberg's second draft would be finished by September 2nd, 1975. In that script, Robert Lacombe was turned into a Frenchman in honor of the French's professional and praised investigation of UFOs per Dr. Allen Hynek. As a result, a translator character was created. Spielberg had many scenes to involve the UFO investigation team's encounter. He added a subplot about Navy Flight 19, which would be found by the investigators. There was an idea to have crop circles in the film and a ship found in the desert. Stephen added that Norman would be fired from his job for abandoning his post during the blackout. Norman is even interviewed by reporters over what he claimed to see, and he is later edited to look like a nut job when the report airs. At the summit, where folks are looking at the skies, Ronnie wants to make out with Norman, but he keeps looking at the sky. Gillian was also expanded upon. She was given a 4-year-old son named Barry. In this version, their kitchen is ransacked, and while her son is chasing playful aliens, she goes after her boy. In this movie, her son is not abducted. Instead, when Gillian becomes obsessed with the visions of the mountain, she has her son looked after by her father, while she sorts things out and heads to the mountain for reasons she does not understand. There, she meets up with Norman again, who she met on the summit while chasing her son. At the end of the film, many abductees debark the alien ship, including Navy Flight 19. The script caused the budget to rise more and more, and was toppling $5.4 million. However, Jaws was still number one and beat The Godfather as the highest-grossing movie ever made. Columbia kept the faith, even though it was way out of their budget parameters. Instead of fighting the new budget, they held their breath, waiting to see what was next. At the time of pre-production, the team behind Close Encounters was constantly on the verge of having the film pulled. Columbia was nervous about shelling out $5.4 million for Stephen's film, and their biggest advocate was David Begelman. Joe Alves stated studio bigwigs often visited the set to check on his work. The studio had a lot of faith in the film, but the money was always an issue. As more crew was hired and new perspectives were added into the mix, the studio realized that the film would cost more, and we will touch on that in just a second. To add to this, Stephen's dynamic duo of producers were going through a divorce as well, and since tensions were high between them, it was decided that Michael would mainly manage Taxi Driver, while she focused on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Other key people were in place for the production early, such as Verna Fields, who brilliantly edited Jaws. John Williams was already spoken to about the idea of the aliens communicating with music, and ideas were already entertained by the director and composer. There were two things that really caused the budget to rise dramatically. The first was the location for the alien contact base on the dark side of the mountain. They needed a big stage, and they searched many places for one that could fit what they were looking for. They found their set in the form of an old Air Force base in Mobile, Alabama, that was run down, and it was perfect because they could open the runway doors to make it appear larger. From this, they found homes in Alabama that could serve as a community where the main character and his family could live. This meant that the shooting would take place in Alabama rather than California, and the budget jumped from $5.4 million to $7 million, and then $9 million. This caused the studio to sweat, but the budget rise wasn't over yet. The second big expense came when the effects team was hired, and the key person asked to manage it was Douglas Trumbull from 2001 fame. He told Julia Phillips up front that it would cost $3 million to achieve the shots needed for the film, and she was floored by that statement. She, in turn, asked Doug how much he would need just to start up. He replied $1 million. This was the moment Julia made a tactical decision. Believing in the film, she made sure Doug had 1/3 of what he needed up front, and then refrained from telling Columbia that the effects would cost $3 million. She figured if the movie got started, the studio would pay the other $2 million once they saw what they had, and the film was deep into production. She feared that if she added another $3 million to the budget, Columbia would shut the picture down, and she was probably right. In Julia Phillips' autobiography, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again, she admitted that she deceived the studio about the expense, but if she hadn't, the film wouldn't have been made. By the time Trumbull's $1 million expense was added to the film, it was now at $11 million. The board at Columbia wanted to shut down the movie, and Columbia was on the verge of bankruptcy. Even healthy studios would consider $11 million a crazy risk. The only real ally Close Encounters had was studio head David Begelman, who had faith not only in the producers and Spielberg, but the project as well. So Begelman did the only thing he could. He put his job on the line and vouched for the expenses. He stated the film would definitely clear $80 million if they stayed true to the project, which was a tall order, and you must remember that in 1974, $10 million was enough for 3 films, and Close Encounters' budget already passed that marker. Finally, on February 1976, Begelman was told by Columbia that Close Encounters could have $11.5 million budget, and Begelman knew if the film was not successful, he would be fired. It was the highest budget picture in Columbia's 50-year history, and filming was to begin on May 17, 1976. Close Encounters was officially given a green light. Casting officially begun before the green light. Steven started this process before Jaws wrapped, and Richard Dreyfuss was there for it all. He had already met the producers and earlier writer John Hill, and Richard heard everything about the film and who Steven Spielberg was considering. Steve McQueen was spoken to about playing the lead, and the two met in a bar where McQueen said he couldn't do the part because he couldn't cry on camera.
And I said, okay, I'll cut out the crying. I'll cut out the crying part. He said, no. He said, the crying broke my heart. The crying actually almost made me cry reading the script. But he said, but once that camera's rolling, I don't think I'm going to be able to deliver the goods to you. And I respectfully have to, say I can't do it. And it broke my heart.
Al Pacino, Jack Nicholson, Robert Duvall, Dustin Hoffman, James Caan, and Gene Hackman were all considered for the lead role. But after a bit, Richard realized the character needed to be an everyman, and Steven understood that too. When the character changed from a Blue Book agent to a normal man, Richard knew he wanted the part and lobbied for it. He then began pestering Steven by saying that no one was right for the part except him, until finally one day, Richard stated,
"And on the day that I said to him, 'You need a child,' That's what you need for this part. He looked up and he said, you got the part.
On February 5th, 1976, Columbia officially announced the movie's production to the media, and it did not come without some backlash. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's lawyer stated that the term Close Encounters of the Third Kind belonged officially to the UFO investigator, and that they could not use the title without consequences. So, Stephen sent the script to Hynek and had a meeting with the man he admired very much. He asked if Hynek could be the technical advisor to the film and consult. Hynek agreed, and to make sure there were no further issues, Columbia then bought the rights to his book, The UFO Experience, for $10,000. To make the film even more respectable, Stephen wanted to get help from the Air Force and NASA, but they declined to cooperate. Instead, NASA sent a 20-page letter to Spielberg stating that the film was dangerous. This only emboldened Stephen. I really found my faith when I heard that the government was opposed to the film. If NASA took the time to write me a 20-page letter, then I knew there must be something happening. Terry Garr was the first choice for Stephen as Ronnie Neary. One day he saw a commercial and thought she was amazing because in 30 seconds she made a unique character in a coffee commercial.
Some of my friends don't really know the difference. I mean, to them, coffee is just something to drink. But I like coffee. I mean, I really get disappointed if it doesn't taste good. So I have to use MJP. Because somehow it always tastes good when it should. And I'm not the greatest cook in the world.
Terry was very excited to work with the maker of Jaws and lobbied for the part of Jillian for a short time, but Stephen wanted her to play the housewife because that was his impetus for selecting her. She studied for the part by moving in with her sister-in-law and followed her around for a few weeks to get the gist of being a wife and mother. Francois Truffaut was picked by Stephen because he loved the director so much. Although Stephen bet the director would not be interested in being in his film, he felt compelled to at least try. He reached out to Truffaut and his agent, who could translate over the phone, and asked the director if he could send him the script and at least consider playing Claude Lacombe. Truffaut was very honored by the gesture and liked Duel and Jaws very much. A special script in French was made for Truffaut, and by March 15th, Truffaut responded, "I like the script, and I like Lacombe." Truffaut was very busy, though, as he was scheduled to shoot his new film, The Man Who Loved Women, in the fall. The bottom line was that if Truffaut's scenes were not finished by mid-August 1976, he would have to leave the project, so there was no margin for error. He also warned that he spoke almost no English, but Stephen had an answer for that: the character of David Laughlin, who would serve as an interpreter for him as well on the set. Enter Bob Balaban, who was a friend of Dreyfus's, and he came to the casting call on March 24th, 1976.
So they said, "How's your French?" And I said, "Well, il y avait beaucoup d'années depuis que j'ai parlé français. Si vous me donnez ce boulot, ce sera très difficile pour moi." But nobody in the room spoke French, so they assumed I spoke fluent French and said, "Great, you have the job."
Now that he got the job, he had to do a crash course in French so he could get back on the horse to speak fluently again. During negotiations for Balaban's contract, Bob felt uneasy taking a part for 20 weeks without seeing a script due to secrecy. To calm his nerves, he gave Richard Dreyfuss a phone call and asked him if he should really go forward and sign for the part, to which Dreyfuss would say, "Stop being an idiot." After the phone call, Balaban held his breath for a bit, and on March 27th at 2 a.m., Richard Dreyfuss called Balaban back and told him that his agent was pushing for too much money from the studio, and it needed to stop or he'd lose the part. Dreyfuss told him that the budget is $11 million, but most of that money was for effects. A few days passed, and on April 5th they spoke again. Dreyfuss told him that Columbia was going to choose someone else because they can't afford him. On April 8th, Balaban signed for the film. Whether they lowered their rates to snag the part based on the phone calls, I cannot confirm. Upon taking the part, Balaban was told to keep his beard and glasses, while Dreyfuss would shave and lose his glasses, so that both actors would not get confused in the movie. The problem was, Dreyfuss couldn't see without his glasses very well. For the aliens, young children were cast and paid $25 a day from the ages of 6 to 7 years old. The girls were from a Mobile ballet school, and their teacher, Susan Helfand, was hired to choreograph their movements. A few boys were used, but they were mainly utilized for wearing the heavy head masks that had articulation. During this period, there was some script polishes done, not only from David Giler, who would later be a nightmare for the Alien franchise, but from two of Steven's old friends, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins. The changes of the script changed the main character's name, gave the unit chasing UFOs the title Mayflower Project, moved the air traffic control towards the start of the film, focused more on Roy's obsession with Devil's Tower, including the shaving cream scene, and added a scene where Roy tears up his yard to get parts to build his Devil's Tower model. The addition of a new character who was a strange old farmer who would later make fools of everyone in the meeting talking about Bigfoot was introduced as well. Steven's buds, Hal and Matthew, also suggested that the boy Barry actually be abducted by the aliens, thus expanding Gillian's motivation and character further. During this period, on March 29, 1976, Spielberg attended the 48th Academy Award and was pretty floored that Jaws did not win Best Picture, but he moved on. One of the winners was Verna Fields, and in one of her interviews later, Verna implied that she saved Jaws in the editing room, which made Spielberg look like the production was a mess. During the first week of May, she was off the project, and many speculated it was because of her implications. Despite this, Spielberg replaced her with Michael Kahn. With everything in place, Francois Truffaut would fly to California on May 5, 1976, and reported to Wardrobe with a salary of $75,000. When he met up with Spielberg, neither spoke their language very well, and Steven recalled their friendly but awkward time together. Mostly, I stood around smiling stupidly. He returned the smile. We smiled at each other for about an hour. The part of Gillian was the last role cast for the film. Steven exhausted over 400 other actresses for the part, including a new drama school graduate from Yale named Meryl Streep. Steven even considered his new girlfriend, Amy Irving. Steven waited for lightning to strike with one of the hopefuls, but those he offered the part turned it down. And that was a few only. The rest just didn't have what he was looking for. Finally, with just 4 days to go till filming started, Steven thought about moving around all of Gillian's scenes until he got the right person for the job. It was then that Steven got a call from director Hal Ashby, who was busy in post-editing Bound for Glory. He suggested Steven check out one of his actresses, Melinda Dillon. Ashby cut some scenes of Melinda for Spielberg to inspect, and he was interested. Problem was, Dillon didn't want to do sci-fi movies, but after she read the script, she accepted Steven's offer. Finally, the film was ready on Sunday, May 16, 1976. The 114-member crew of Close Encounters flew from California to South Dakota. From there, they were driven 2 hours by bus to a Super 8 motel where they would stay in Gillette, Wyoming. On Monday morning, May 17, 1976, filming began for all Devil Tower location scenes. The first scene filmed was Richard Dreyfuss driving against traffic to enter the area. A few days before filming ended in this location, producer-chief Stanley Jaffe from Columbia Pictures showed how short-sighted and power-drunk he was when he disrupted the entire film for 4 hours. Jaffe read the script with the scenes written by Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, and was turned off by Barry being kidnapped. He approached Julia Phillips and believed it would turn away the audience. What the hell is this? This is not the movie I bought. Stanley demanded the abduction be stricken from the film, but Julia and Steven refused. After arguing for a bit, Stanley egotistically canceled the movie. Julia knew just how to handle this bozo and suggested they film 2 scenes, one where Barry is taken and the other where his mother pulled him back, thus preventing the abduction. Of course, Julia and Steven were going to keep the abduction scene, but it appeared that they were satiating Stanley Jaffe. So He reversed his decision 4 hours later. Stephen would never film an alternate version of the abduction and stuck to his guns. When the crew got to Mobile, Alabama, it was hot and humid, and it was their home for 3 months. Stephen had the best of it as he stayed at a rented house with Rick Fields and his editor Michael Kahn, who cut the film as they went. The Neary home was located at 1613 Carlisle Drive East. Production designer Joe Alves told the studio to just buy the house, but the studio treated him like he was stupid. So Alves and another decided to buy the house and charge the studio rent. That way, they could fix it up a little and sell it for more when the shoot was over. When they told the studio they were going to do this, the studio jumped the gun and bought the house instead for $35,000. After the shoot was finished, the home was sold for $50,000. The big set used for Alien Contact was the biggest indoor set used at that time. It cost $700,000 to make. The only problem with the set was that it was 120 degrees Fahrenheit inside, and if you were working in one of the cubicles, it was 140 degrees. Folks passed out, and as a result, many extras would quit, be replaced, and then they would quit. Yet spirits were high because those behind the film were enthusiastic about what they were making, and even Richard Dreyfuss would try to lift morale on the set by bringing cases of ice cream bars for all to share on the set. Despite this, the enemy of this film was seemingly the studio heads responsible for it. Due to the unique lighting of the UFOs, fog had to be utilized to capture the simulated moments, and when they used it, many in the crew got eye irritation, sinus issues, and it was hard to breathe. Stephen referred to this set as this film's shark, which referred to the 1975 Jaws film. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch those vids, as the shark was a nightmare in itself. Due to the details and logistics of these lighting scenes, the production schedule slowed down a bit, and when the bigwigs from Columbia showed up again, they made a stink, because for every day of additional shooting, it would cost $50,000, and they demanded reasons why scenes were slowing or falling behind. Julia Phillips put the blame on Vilmos Zsigmond. Zsigmond was best known before Close Encounters of the Third Kind for McCabe and Miss Miller, Images, and Deliverance. It was put forth that he was slow in the lighting and overly detailed, and perhaps out of his depth. A person who didn't want to be named on the set, but was quoted in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the making of Steven Spielberg's classic, stated, "They blamed Vilmos because he had never lit a set like this before, but nobody had ever lit a set like this before. There had never been a set like this before." Others on the crew attested that Zsigmond was out of his depth, but not Steven Spielberg. He was told to fire Vilmos, but he refused. He was pressured harder, but Steven stood up for his cinematographer, and eventually the studio left the issue lie. However, execs and Julia would constantly nitpick Zsigmond for the rest of principal photography, and he really felt betrayed by the studio and Julia. A perfect example of their micromanagement is when the alien ship opened up. Vilmos overexposed the aliens to hide their costumes and features. The lab printed one of the scenes too brightly, and it looked like there was nothing on the film. Julia was outraged that Vilmos ruined a day of filming, and after realizing the lab's error, he told Julia to go back and tell the lab to print the film darker. She did so, and the film was perfect, as Vilmos planned. Despite the treatment he got, he persevered, and as a result, he won an Academy Award for cinematography for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, making those who doubted him look like morons. No doubt, they appreciated his work after the film was released. The producers from Columbia were nuisances not only to Zsigmond, but production designer Joe Alves as well. When he was building his Crescendo set in Mobile, Alabama, the producers were frustrated that it cost $250,000. They said it should be built for $75,000. To which Joe replied, "Well, you don't understand. That's the square footage. It costs so much a square foot to build a set. So if you don't want that," and I did a very dramatic thing, I took a piece of sheet metal and I cut the model to pieces until it was this little thing, and I said, "There, that's $75,000. Is that what you want?" And they said, "Oh, no, that's okay. All right, build the thing. You sort of had to do this sometimes." Unfortunately, it didn't stop there, and Julia Phillips was starting to lose control of her composure. Julia would often lose her temper and blast away at those around her bluntly. One time, she began screaming at Joe Alves for the lighting on the set. When he told her he had nothing to do with the lighting, he just builds the sets, she got even more hostile and raised her voice further. Often, members of the crew would speak to Spielberg about her emotional tantrums, and it was pressure he didn't need. He had enough. Crew would speak of her acting high as a kite one moment and then sobbing uncontrollably the next. Many thought she was having a nervous breakdown, possibly due to her recent divorce, but those close to her knew she had an addictive personality. Stephen was very much against substance abuse, and he didn't even drink. He was no stranger to Julia's parties and social gatherings, and furthermore, Goldie Hawn was also a friend to Julia back then, and Goldie was always trying to encourage Julia to stop using cocaine whenever she saw her. Stephen knew all of this because he worked closely with Goldie in Sugarland Express and had a friendship outside of the film with both women. As Julia's erratic behavior grew, those that were not satisfied with the situation involving her complained to whoever they could, and soon, rumors were growing and starting to spread throughout Hollywood that Julia was losing it and had drug problems. One of Julia's biggest critics was Francois Truffaut because he was very friendly with Vilmos Zsigmond and was outraged the way Julia would often go after him. In fact, Francois felt that the majority of the delays and problems for the film was due to her destroying morale, being disorganized, and unprepared. Francois did his best to keep his mouth shut, but it wouldn't last forever. Now that some scenes were falling behind, the studio kept panicking, and after the executive visit involving Zsigmond, they deduced that the film would cost $15 million. With gritted teeth, they approved the new budget, but now assigned a studio bigwig, John Veitch, to remain on set overseeing all expenditures and eyeing everything from now on. Luckily, Veitch was not like most of the studio executives in that he was fair, open, and encouraging to Stephen's needs, and more often than not, John would back requested expenditures because he saw it helped and served the film. During breaks, the crew did various things. Stephen and Dreyfuss would continue their tradition of playing video games. This time, it was Tank and Gunfighter. Sometimes they continued playing Pong, but Dreyfuss always won. Sometimes friends and family would visit, including George Lucas, who just finished shooting Star Wars. Another of Stephen's visitors, besides his girlfriend Amy Irving, was Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, who were currently working with Stephen on a script for 1941. Someday, YouTube, someday. I'm going to cover that one. I simply love that movie. For Terry Garr's free time, she and Francois Truffaut romanced each other. When time would allow, Joe Alves took trips to Florida to do location scouting for Jaws 2, as he was going to be the production designer, associate producer, and second unit director for that film. And for those that don't remember, Richard Dreyfuss was always verbal on his viewpoints politically, even in 1976. When the Ku Klux Klan did a march in Mobile for 4th of July, Dreyfuss stated publicly that he had a right to protest their existence. Within a day of the comment, he was receiving death threats, and 2 bodyguards were assigned to protect him. Balaban looked a lot like Dreyfuss, and because of that, he was worried and asked if he could have a bodyguard himself. He was told the budget of the film could not cover that request. So, instead of staying, Balaban went home during the 4th of July holiday to avoid everything altogether. together. On August 17, 1976, the crew celebrated Balaban's birthday and the end of production in Mobile, Alabama. While most of the crew left, some remained behind to dismantle the big sets and return things to the way they were. Thanks to the production being 2 weeks behind schedule, the production could not go to India as initially planned. Everything had to be postponed because Truffaut's new film, Small Change, was opening soon, and he had a schedule to keep as well as a director himself. As a result, this meant the release of the film had to be pushed back from Easter to the summer of 1977 as well. During the downtime, editing and special effects was the focus. A few extra shots were done as well. Steven rethought the aliens after seeing the remake of King Kong and wanted to film the aliens like that instead. This added another $100,000 to the budget. On October 1st, 1976, Truffaut's film Small Change opened in New York, and with it came interviews. During an interview with the New York Times, the rumors of troubles on the set of Close Encounters of the Third Kind came up, and Truffaut, not wanting to mince words, let the cat out of the bag and singled out Julia Phillips as the cause of all the film problems. She is incompetent, unprofessional. You can write that. She knows I feel this way. Once again, Steven was thrust in the middle when Julia and the studio requested that he make a response to that statement. He stated that Truffaut's comments were rather unkind, and then he stated, "Knowing him as I do, it is hard for me to believe that he said these things. I have never had such constructive and consistent support from a producer as I have had from Julia Phillips, and I know that Columbia Pictures concurs." Julia was not happy with Steven's response. Steven's reply was published in November in the New York Times, but it didn't matter. A few weeks later, Julia was pulled over for driving suspiciously. When two policemen approached her, they smelled marijuana in the car and they searched it. They found a vial of cocaine and arrested her for driving under the influence and drug possession. Of course, she got off with technicalities, but it was all over the press, and the news even aired it on Good Morning America, giving both the production and the studio another black eye. When December came around, more bad news occurred when a stunt driver almost died on the set during the scene where the police car flies off the road. The irony of this was the new cinematographer was partially the reason. Vilmos Zsigmond thought he was returning after Mobile, and Steven even stated that he was his man, but Vilmos was quietly replaced for some of the reshoots, and this was one of them. Although Vilmos felt terribly betrayed, he came out looking great, not only with his Academy Award, but because he was nowhere near the mess that caused the accident. The accident was all over the press, and the driver had a concussion, damaged his back and legs, and crushed his heel. The footage of the accident remained in the film. Basically, the cause of the entire accident was miscommunication. The driver drove too fast, and the ramp for the car to shoot off the edge was too high. Finally, on February 22nd, the crew went to India, where they would film the village who encountered the UFOs. Julia Phillips and Francois Truffaut stayed far away from each other. The shoot would end in India on February 26, 1977. In May 1977, the Flight 19 scenes were filmed, and Truffaut and Balaban were back together, this time without Julia Phillips, who was now becoming a nuisance to the production, and Spielberg had no patience for her anymore. Steven asked her ex-husband, Michael Phillips, to supervise the crew for the rest of the production, while Julia would continue working with the studio. The problem was, she had little allies, because she was constantly ignoring her duties and responsibilities. Many times, she would not show up for studio meetings and was never on time. When May 25, 1977 occurred, Star Wars released, and Steven took a vacation with his friend George Lucas to Hawaii, and it was then that the two began first talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark. once again, Close Encounters' premiere was changed. Now it was no longer coming out in summer, it was supposed to come out in the fall. However, as the summer of 1977 was coming to an end, Julia Phillips' credibility would now go down more with Columbia Studios. Her earlier attempt to mislead the studio about Douglas Trumbull's estimate for special effects was now ready to be paid up. Although she gave him $1 million at the start of the job, she now needed to pay up the other $2 million that she never told the studio about in an attempt to mislead the studio itself. Julia had to come clean, and the studio was very angry at her deception. Although the studio was really liking the film, they had no idea they had this expense, and it really put the studio on the ropes. With no choice, the studio paid this bill. By September 1977, the studio would fire Julia Phillips from the production completely. Her drug use was now becoming visible to everyone, and during one meeting, she actually brought cocaine and put it on the table in front of the executives. She was also very volatile and would argue with executives and even Steven Spielberg. She tried wrestling for more control over the film in a desperate power grab, but on September 13th, 1977, she was banned from the Burbank Studios lot, and she would fall into deeper drug addictions. In her autobiography, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again, she admitted to wasting over $100,000 on her drug habits. In the book and later interviews, she would go further by revealing secrets about everyone she knew in Hollywood, according to her, whether friend or foe, including Steven Spielberg, and even her old friend Goldie Hawn, who she described as a girl with dirty hair.
You said these people are your friends, and yet it seems from what Phil said, you talk about them and you're so down on them. How can they be your friends if you talk about them?
Well, ex-friends.
Not to be outdone, David Begelman, who was Julia's ex-boss, was discovered to be embezzling money from the studio in the tune of $60,000. It was actor Cliff Robertson that begun the investigation that toppled Begelman. Begelman used to be the talent agent in charge of Cliff Robertson, and he had the studio write him a check for $10,000. The IRS contacted Robertson about this $10,000 check that he never saw. Turned out that Begelman forged Cliff Robertson's signature and took the money for himself. It was discovered that he had done this with several other people. Begelman got a slap on the wrist, and surprisingly, Columbia did not fire him when they discovered his actions. Rather, he took a leave of absence and would return to the studio as an exec, but no longer the head of the studio. However, as news leaked of his actions, the loyalists on the board who liked Begelman suddenly became less protective of him, and more lawsuits and investigations were filed until Begelman resigned in February 5th, 1978. In the end, Close Encounters had a $19.4 million budget, but when the execs saw the finished film, they loved it, and would go on to promote the film to the tune of $7.5 million merchandising budget. Columbia was slowly growing back to financial security, with the success of Taxi Driver, Shampoo, and The Wind and the Lion. And if Close Encounters was a hit, Columbia would be back in the financial saddle. Though Stephen was uncertain the film would make a ton of money, the studio was more optimistic than he was, and on November 16th, 1977, it was released. When Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released, there was a huge marketing push to garner awareness for the film. There was the normal soundtrack released on record and 8-track, as well as a film novel, The Diary of Bob Balaban, a photo novel, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind Mindbenders by Joseph and Lenore Scott. There was a postcard book, Frisbees by Whammo, a Parker Brothers game, puzzles, Viewmaster stills, and bendable figures. There were t-shirts, a comic book covering the film, lunchboxes. Most of all, for fans of movie trading cards, collectors like myself could enjoy the Topps trading cards, consisting of 66 cards and 11 stickers that cost 15 cents a pack. The funny thing about these cards was that Richard Dreyfuss, Francois Truffaut, and Bob Balaban were not on a single card, and as a result, Melinda Dillon is on most of them, as well as Terry Garr. Another cool merchandising gimmick done for the film was to make another unique card line and distribute it through loaves of Wonder Bread. For every loaf of bread you bought, there would be a card floating around inside, and there were 24 to collect. The way Columbia Pictures released this film was really confusing because the studio was very eager to get this movie to theaters, but rolled it out extremely slow. If you lived in Los Angeles or New York, you were lucky because that meant you could see it on Wednesday, November 16th, 1977. Then, on November 23rd, more theaters got the film. Spielberg purported that this hurt the film's success in the long run. By mid-December, the film finally reached a wide release and became a huge success. The film would be in theaters for 411 days, and it would go on to make $116 million during its original theatrical run. At the time, there were big competitors going against this film during its November-December release, and one was Star Wars, which was still making between 1 to 3 million weekly in theaters, and back then that was good money. Recent films like Heroes, Pete's Dragon, and The Turning Point were the only films that were popular. On November 18th, 1977, Semi-Tough, with Burt Reynolds, Chris Christopherson, and Jill Clayburgh, came out, which would make $37.1 million. On November 30th, Richard Dreyfuss competed with his own movie when the release of Goodbye Girl came out, and it made a whopping $102 million. Saturday Night Fever would then hit theaters on December 16th, 1977, and bring in $94.2 million. And by December 21st, Clint Eastwood's The Gauntlet would be released, and it would make $26.4 million. By Christmas, Close Encounters had a wide release, and for weeks to come, The Goodbye Girl, Saturday Night Fever, and Close Encounters would battle for the #1 spot weekly. When I first saw this movie in 1979 in Gießen, Germany at the Post Cinemas, I knew nothing about the stars or ufology. By the time I was 8, after seeing this and Alien, I sought out anything about this subject. And before I was out of high school, I had read every Time Life book pertaining to paranormal events. If there were books in the local libraries, you could bet I read those as well. I watched countless unsolved mystery episodes and documentaries. During my 20s, you would rarely see me without a book or focus on UFO material weekly. Today, I don't study as much as I used to. After spending about 30 years studying this subject, I've learned so much. And once you become well versed in subject matter like Roswell, S4, Travis Walton, Bob Lazar, Phil Schneider, mutilations, abduction experimentations, and worst of all, the horrors of Dulce Base in New Mexico, things get really murky as to what is really going on. The more you dig, the more you realize it is less a physical phenomenon than a spiritual one. Once you become really versed in things, sometimes you lose faith in the media, and it feels like you're falling down a rabbit hole when exploring this subject. That's not to say I don't study stuff today, but most of the time, it's repetition of stuff I already know. Anyways, forgive me for such tangents, as I have always been passionate about this subject matter. Now, before we go over this movie, there are two things I want to bring up. The first thing is the novelization for the film. This novel was written by Steven Spielberg himself, and although there are some scenes that are slightly different than the final product, it pretty much matches the film closely. The book really adds some details to the movie that we just didn't have time to realize during the film. So when such insights occur, I will point them out, and you can pretty much take it as gospel. If you are a fan of this film, I highly recommend you check this book out. There are many interviews with actors that back up the information in this novel, but for the sake of time, I won't be showing these interviews. In my eyes, the book is good enough, since the author is actually the maker of the film itself. The second thing to understand is that the sky in every scene during this movie is its own character, and every shot where you see the sky, it's important. In most scenes, there are visuals you will never notice unless you watch the skies rather than focus on whatever scene is unfolding. It's a movie that requires repeat viewings to get it all. I highly suggest you look to the top frame as much as possible, as you will usually see something that will catch your attention. When I was first planning the movie, I felt like I had to frame everything with more sky than ground. I felt the sky was as important to the surprise and mystery of Close Encounters as the water was to Jaws. To give you a perfect example of this, I only need point out the opening shot in the Sonora Desert, Mexico. At first, you see 3 lights. Then 2 lights come towards us, and we realize it's a car. However, the 3rd light is just sitting in the background in the sky, as if it's watching the audience and the car. Could it be a UFO, a light tower, a lighting gaff? Who knows? And that's the point. We are treated like UFO enthusiasts during the movie because once you get used to seeing things move in the skies above, you keep looking up during every scene in anticipation. It's brilliant, and if you get a chance to see this in theaters someday, I highly recommend that. The group arriving here is called the Mayflower Project, and it works for the United Nations. Stephen wanted this film to be about all countries because the UFO phenomenon is everywhere in the world, and he wanted to acknowledge that. It is then that the planes of Flight 19 are discovered. Now, this flight group is not fictional. Flight 19 was a training group of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers out of Fort Lauderdale on Wednesday, December 5th, 1945 at 2:10 p.m. The skies were blue and clear upon takeoff, and under the command of Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, who was a World War II vet with 2,000 hours of flying time. They were supposed to do bombing run exercises before returning to base with about a 2 to 3 hour flight time in all. The team dropped their bombs, and it was noted at 3:40 p.m. that the training group felt discomfort and disorientation as they made their final turns to begin their flight home. As another bombing group went out, a transmission was intercepted from Taylor himself. Both my compasses are out, and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it is broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get back to Fort Lauderdale. After some communication issues, the weather started to turn bad at 4:30 p.m., and none of the navigators in Taylor's team could figure out where they were. Taylor's next communication was, "We'll continue to fly 270 degrees west until we hit landfall or run out of gas." Chatting could be heard within his group at base for about an hour until 6:20 p.m. when Taylor gave his last order. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the last plane drops below 10 gallons, we will all go down together." Planes were sent out from all over Florida to find these missing pilots. However, one of the planes searching for this group also turned up missing. For 5 days, hundreds of aircraft searched for the training group and the maritime plane that also came up missing during the search, but not a trace was found of any of them. Some ufology theorists purport that there was a lone message about seeing something that was not from this world, and it was kept from the public. In the film, there is a moment where a text says, "Approximately 46 gallons in the right tank." This very relevant scene proposes that after Taylor gave the order to ditch together when the first plane dropped to 10 gallons, the aliens took the planes, and one of them had this amount in their tank at that moment. Or the lone message about seeing something from another world was the true reason for their disappearance. For our first deleted scene of the film, Lacombe gives specific instructions for handling everything for research. But it's best this was cut, as it added little to the film.
Protégez-le de l'extérieur. Very well from the outside. Yes, sir. Je veux qu'on me relève les empreintes de doigts. And you also have to get all fingerprints off of all the objects in the airplane.
The Air Traffic Control Center at Indianapolis, where Harry Crane is communicating to both flights, is another mood-making scene for the first act to build mystery and point out that during the 70s, it was not popular to report seeing strange things in the sky. One must remember that during the time of this film, UFOs were not mainstream and were treated treated with skepticism and scorn, especially when fringe groups like cults and hoaxers purported wild theories publicly, like aliens came from Venus or Mars. I appreciate that the Air Traffic Control Center puts a date on this film, and I'm glad it did, because it takes a snapshot of the mentality at that time. Of course, the frustrating thing about the movie is that right at the beginning it states present day. This is a flaw in the film in my eyes. When I watch this, I see it as a time capsule. I do not see this as a present-day film in any way, especially when so many things dates this movie. When we get to Muncie, Indiana, Barry Geiler is introduced, and he has little fear. His child mentality makes him completely open to the alien phenomenon. A very important thing to realize is that Barry and Roy Neary are the same character. Their youth and open-mindedness guides them.
Dreyfus, his character, and Barry's character are the same character.
This is so important to really get what this film is trying to say. When Barry goes to the kitchen, it is a masterful performance by this little boy, and it is ingenious how Spielberg directed him. Before we get to that, I need to point out that Barry is looking at several aliens in the kitchen. The book is very clear about this. So when Barry enters, his look is at first fearful, and then after either mental communication or by their actions, Barry calms and plays with the visitors. To achieve this scene, Spielberg put Bob Westmoreland in a gorilla suit, and the moment Barry jumps is when it was revealed to him. You can see the boy was about to bolt, but Spielberg removed the mask, and Barry smiled when he realized it was his friendly pal on the set underneath. The delivery is perfect. It's a masterclass on how to direct, and it shows how good Stephen really was during the 70s when he embraced his youthful outlook. Now, if you notice, Jillian is a mess at the start of the movie. On her bedside, you can see medicines, and her home is a bit messy because she has been suffering from the flu all week. Jillian is an artist per Stephen's revised script. We will also learn that she is a widow in later deleted scenes, and press notes, as well as interviews, also confirmed this information. In an American Cinematographer magazine, Joe Alves stated that her house belongs to Jillian's mother, and that Jillian is staying there temporarily, while her mother is staying at Jillian's place in town. When Jillian looks outside to see Barry playing, look close. Something is moving in the sky. The Neary home was mainly decorated by Terry Garr. She was told to buy things to make her feel at home, so she did. She even made chore charts. Now, the character of Ronnie Neary is all about her domestic reality. Her character is obsessed about having a life of normalcy, per Terry Garr, and it shows in the film. I worked very hard in developing this character with Stephen's help. Stephen said these were middle-class people, and the wife was very worried about not being able to make payments on things. So, to have my husband go crazy and lose his job would have been terrible. I went from there. Another thing mentioned by Steven Spielberg himself was that Roy and Ronnie's relationship was a very tenuous one, and they had been together since high school, and the only thing they had in common now was routines. Roy Neary is a grown child. He still collects and focuses on toys and is very honest about what he thinks and feels.
Richard Dreyfuss was a bigger kid than the children he was raising in his suburban house.
This, of course, was one of the main reasons Richard Dreyfuss got the part. In the novel, by Steven Spielberg, the introduction to the Neary family was a bit longer. However, the scene where Roy helps his 8-year-old son Brad with his fraction problem is a bit different. I actually prefer what we got in the theatrical cut. It's a perfect introduction to Roy's wit and bluntness. I also think it's quite funny how he says,
"Quickly, Brad. There are thousands of lives at stake. Brad, any answer?"
In the novel, Ronnie comes in the room complaining about how she never gets to go out. Meanwhile, Roy would talk to his son about math and states he's not trying hard enough to understand it. Then Brad would say he doesn't need to try while he has a calculator. Finally, Ronnie would state, "I give this railroad 2 more weeks. I bet it ends up in the basement with the auto tennis and the electric toilet and all the rest. Jesus, can't we do something? I'm serving time in this house." Thus, the book paints a clear picture that Roy is under assault critically from his family right out of the gate. He is alone in his own home. The movie narrates this more subtly, and yet to the same effect. After Brad doesn't answer his father about fractions, Toby, who is also described as a tornado in the novel, runs to his sister's playpen and begins banging the doll until it breaks, while his parents talk. If you notice, Ronnie says nothing to Toby. In fact, when she looks at the boy and approaches him, she doesn't tell him to stop at all. Instead, when a piece breaks off, she picks it up for the rabble-rousing boy, rather than telling him to pick it up. Instead of disciplining or stopping the boy, she instead chooses to lecture Roy about his stuff being on her table. This is really effective storytelling to describe the family dynamic, and you need to pay close attention to notice these things. While Roy wants to share Pinocchio with his family, and he is enthusiastic about it, the family rejects his idea in favor of golf. After Ronnie lectures him on his sarcastic comment about becoming age 9 to his son, he argues for his point about Pinocchio until he demands that Toby stop, while trying to appease Ronnie's judgmental nature of him. Ronnie sits there with an unsatisfied look on her face. If you also pay attention further, when Toby says, Dad said they could watch more of the movie in the family room, which happens to be the 10 Commandments, Ronnie vetoes their father's permission, thus belittling him further. She looks at Roy in blatant frustration and says the movie is 4 hours long, and then you can hear Roy say, I told them they could only watch 5 of the commandments. Now, if you don't believe Steven Spielberg's take in the novel, or what the film sets up, this is what Terry Garr herself said about her own character.
I wrote so many things about this character and what she did and where she did all day and what she thought of the neighbors and what she wore and what kind of shoes she wore. I just went nuts on Ronnie Neary. And then, none of it's on the screen except it's there in subliminal, but I did a lot of work for that part. And then I got to be like Ronnie Neary, that's the kind of stuff she would do. Just picking apart those little details as if they were important. That's the kind of person that Rick Dreyfuss's character was married to. And no wonder he was seeing UFOs. She was driving him crazy.
This is yet another important story beat because it ties to Roy's motivation and actions during the film. When we leave this house, we see the sky again and there is something flying above before we return to Jillian looking for her boy in E.T.'s forest. In another deleted scene, Roy gets to his job to discover havoc everywhere. He is sent out to check on a team working in the field.
But I'm in charge here right now, and you're going to Crystal Lake.
I am.
Now, I can't help it. Everybody's everywhere. Now, if you have any questions, you get on the horn to me, direct.
And when he arrives there, it is discovered that the entire line is missing. When he calls into base, he reports that lights are being seen in other areas and asks if the power is on in said areas. When his boss says no, and they intend to turn power on, Roy states that there might be crews working in that dead zone who could get zapped if the power is turned on and maybe killed. His boss ignores him and tells him to stay put and manage the team. Roy, wanting to make sure the others in the area are safe, commandeers the help of his buddy Earl Johnson to take over the situation here while he makes sure the other area is safe.
If he's right, they're gonna suspend your ass so high that even the Job Placement Corps won't find it.
This scene needed to be in the film because it shows Roy's cares for others and that he's responsible. I have heard many a commentator of this film state they thought Roy was a character they didn't like and his motivations were not clear. This scene would have helped that image a bit. The next deleted scene is both an alternate scene and a deleted one. It is very relevant to the control tower scene earlier in the film as well. Originally, there was no Flight 19 scene, and it was the last thing filmed for this movie. This scene would have actually been the first moment we would have met Lacombe, Laughlin, and Lacombe's driver, Robert, played by Lance Henriksen. They would introduce each other, and then the scene with Flight 31 would continue. Now, if you remember, Flight 31 was the plane that had the run-in with the UFO during the tower scene, and now it has landed. The Mayflower Project team would board the plane and then demand all cameras claiming military secrecy. Then Lacombe would demand the flight recorder.
We want the flight recorder, and don't wash the plane.
Then the scene would revert back into the car where Lacombe would ask Laughlin to translate a steamy romance novel. The scene was kind of funny, but a little strange. The scene is pretty good, but the introduction of Flight 19 is leaps and bounds better. More deleted scenes would occur, and the next one is utter chaos, and it should have never been in the film or even filmed. Roy drives into a crowd of people who not only crowd his car, but some climb on it.
Yes. Did they go off like that? Thank you. Is this Tulum? At least tell me, is this Tulum?
Everyone is talking at once to the point of overload, and then a man gives sloppy directions to get him back on course. It serves little purpose and was best cut. Back to the normal cut of the film, Roy is out in the middle of nowhere and he encounters the craft in a very effective scene. The car was literally rotated to achieve the shots needed, and Roy getting sunburned and frightened the way he does is just great filmmaking. I also really appreciate that there is no score for this scene as well. The silence and events is enough. Another really cool detail is that the noise by the insects stop when the craft is over him, which is a common occurrence reported in UFO cases. As the craft moves away down the street, the life returns to the area. Taken in by the moment, Roy goes chasing these weird craft. In the book, it is noted that he thought about going back to the work site, but it is noted that he is way more excited than frightened at this point. After meeting up with Jillian and Barry, there was a deleted take when the strange farmer, played by Robert Blossom, would approach Roy and state that the curve on the road is very dangerous. And then he starts talking about how they come through late so they don't disturb the residents. It was then that the ships would fly by, while Barry laughs and shouts, "Ice cream, ice cream." Roy heads out after them, while the farmer says behind him that he should stick around. The UFOs were originally going to look like the 1950s version of flying saucers, but as designs evolved, Spielberg and team thought that the alien ships would take forms of non-threatening things they saw from above, like McDonald's arches and Chevron gas station logos. A thing to note is that the Crescendo Summit set shared space with the Devil's Tower mountain replica that Dreyfuss and Dillon would be seen climbing later in the film. The set was designed so a car could enter the stage, build up speed to climb up it, and then continue down and exit through the other side of the building. The set was designed to withstand the weight of 4 cars. After the car crashes, there is a deleted scene where Roy and the police are in the police station trying to report the events at 3:30 in the morning. The captain of the police station berates his officer, stating that he doesn't want his office to be in the National Enquirer, and he suspends the officer that crashed the car. This causes everyone to back off reporting out of fear. Roy sees that he's alone and decides to leave without making a report as well. It is 4 a.m. when Roy barges into his home to take his family to the summit. Now I want to take a moment to focus on Ronnie. Even though she was set up to be really grating and somewhat divisive of her husband at the beginning of the film, her character is a bit more complex than that. She does not know what the hell is going on here, and rather than pitch a fit, she entertains her husband's spontaneous moment. After all, she was described in the novel as someone wanting to get out of the house, and in interviews she was described as someone stuck in routines rather than life. So when she is out on the road with Roy, she kind of appreciates this moment. When he tells her what he saw, she entertains him with questions of what did they look like, and wants to reminisce about romantic moments with her husband. It shows another side of this character rather than just an unsupporting wife who is not strong when times get tough, which, in the end, is an unfair assessment of her character. It's subtle stuff, but it is there, and the film shows this. Another thing to note about Roy is that he is focused on the wonder of what he just saw. It literally consumes him. Work has been trying to call him, and he admits earlier to turning off his phone.
Well, Governor, they want you to call them right away. They said they couldn't reach you.
I turned the radio off.
Later, we discover that Roy will be fired for this because technically he abandoned his post, which was the work team that he left by putting Earl Johnson in charge. He also disobeyed direct orders. The fact that power came back up is inconsequential. His actions had repercussions. Some state that this is not fleshed out in the film without taking deleted scenes into account, and I totally disagree. Even without the deleted scenes, we know Roy was lost. Then he chased police and then went straight to his family and dragged them to the summit. It was therefore evident that he didn't show up for work at the area he was assigned to go to, and he turned off his communications. Thus, job abandonment is clearly implied from what the theatrical version shows us. Now, a scene that was filmed and confirmed in interviews was when Roy and his family was at the Crescendo Summit. The way it was supposed to end was to have Ronnie jokingly ask him if the aliens landed right now, would he go on one of the ships? Roy is still excited about his encounter and would look at her seemingly dumbfounded by her question and reply, "Jesus Christ, yes."
Ooh, Jesus Christ.
Not having this scene in the movie really bothered Richard Dreyfuss because he said it showed how his character was so desperate to escape from his dreary suburban existence. This scene was mentioned in the novel as well. The end result of this conversation would have Ronnie outraged and hurt by his words, and their relationship would revert back to what we saw at the start of the film. One thing that really hurts the suspension of disbelief in this film now that time has passed is the reveal of the Cotopaxi. This was another real-life event where a ship came up missing, and it was assumed due to the Bermuda Triangle. The Cotopaxi had a crew of 32 that vanished during a cargo run from Charleston, South Carolina to Havana in December 1925. The ship sent out a distress call during a tropical storm and was never seen again until the 1980s, where a strange wreckage was discovered off St. Augustine, Florida. At the time, the ship was referred to as the Bear Wreck, and for over 20 years, investigations by marine biologists tried to identify it. In the end, blueprint specs and some design flaws from a lawsuit, as well as some coal in some holds, resulted in a positive identification. In January 2020, the wreck was positively identified as the Cotopaxi without any doubt. Still, the scene is pretty awesome nonetheless. On day 2, the shaving cream scene would be next, and it is here where we see Ronnie is completely not supportive of her husband. Whether this was a jealous response to his actions on the summit or not does not matter one bit. Roy is very open and interested in what he saw, and Ronnie sees a newspaper article that can confirm it. But she doesn't offer that validation at all. Rather than encourage and support him, she cuts out the article and keeps it from him. She goes even further by telling Roy what they are going to tell people when they see his sunburn, thus demanding he lie. And then, when his son Brad asks his father about the UFOs, Ronnie shuts down the conversation completely by saying that Roy doesn't believe in them. She is totally ignoring his perspective and destroying any agency he has whatsoever with his son. All of these things in the film should be enough to convince anyone that Roy is in an empty and suffocatingly controlled relationship with Ronnie. Now, most proponents of this film at the end will always tout that Roy was with a crazy family that was completely opposite of him, and therefore, when he goes on the mothership, what he does is perfectly justified. Although I am extremely supportive of this movie, I can't just agree with that assessment, because during this scene, Brad is very supportive of his father by trying to stand on his side about the UFOs, even though his mother suffocates both their opinions.
Mom, I believe in him. I believe in him too. Oh, no, you don't.
It is simply heartbreaking to see Ronnie do this to the boy and her husband. At the end of this sequence, the film shows you more revelations when the children start arguing about if UFOs have bases on the moon. and what they do. It is analogous to Ronnie's methodology. The film would double down on this if it had kept the next deleted scene where Roy attends a neighborhood gathering. Ronnie would demand Roy lie about his face burn and would tell everyone the lie while watching him like a hawk. Clearly, she doesn't trust him, and I would argue that she has concern for him as well. However, that concern seems secondary to her social status, and soon he starts looking up at the skies in fascination. The scene then falls apart as it gets a little silly, where everyone else looks up at the sky like Roy to see what he's looking for. The scene would end with a jello mold that makes him think of Devil's Tower. After the breakthrough in India, Lacombe devises that the aliens singing to people is actually a form of communication and uses a visual medium to represent the tones. We later discover that he uses this to send out a signal to the skies to respond to the alien message, something that the majority of contactees like Roy Neary would never have the resources to do. Later that night, Roy would return to the summit, and there were more deleted scenes that has never been released that was shot, which had Roy talking to the Sky Watchers. This included Roy asking an 80-year-old lady about the UFOs appearing nightly, and her showing him a blurry picture claiming they were extraterrestrials. The book is really insightful about this sequence in that Roy feels that the people on the summit are merely sightseers rather than people who want to really understand the phenomenon. It is then that Gillian zeroes in on Roy and approaches him. A thing that should have been in the movie was the immediate familiarity between Julian and Roy. During the scene where she shows him her sunburn, she showed him her chest, to which he blushed. Gillian would apologize with her openness and say, "I'm sorry, I just had the feeling you were my oldest friend." It only takes one experience like that, doesn't it? This scene's dialogue was a mistake to remove from the film and was a better take. You can see when these two are together that both Gillian and Roy are immediately drawn to each other and communicate very naturally. She is supportive and interested in him like he is her. Like him, she is also a believer who follows her impulses and is a free spirit like Roy. In essence, they are made for each other, and it's pretty clear Roy should be with her rather than Ronnie. Another thing to note during this scene is the photographer, who was originally in the film more. All his scenes were cut with the exception of Barry. This man works for the Mayflower Project and is documenting the people here to investigate them. There was a scene where he takes a picture of Roy and Gillian by the truck. He would then focus on Barry, where she says,
He's a little young for a record, don't you think?
Another great insight in the book is when Roy tells Gillian that he has 3 kids of his own after sitting with her and Barry. Gillian asks if his wife understands, and he sarcastically answers, implying that she does not. Gillian would tell him she tried to tell her mother to no avail, and Roy would ask about Barry's father. Her response is, "Died. I don't suppose he'd have understood this any better than your wife does." Once again, these scenes would have been so important in the film, but honestly, the movie has so much to cover that whatever you cut from it would hurt it somewhere. I always felt that Close Encounters needed to be a 3-hour movie, and if it was, it would only make it better. When it comes to the scene where the Mayflower Project receives coordinates, it's time for us to begin talking about the aliens themselves. There is a lot of debate on YouTube that the aliens and their actions are plot holes or contradictory, and I guess I don't agree with these arguments, which we will later explore. For now, I want to explore the message itself. Some of the complaints out there are that the aliens are just flying around, putting mental images and invitation into people's heads so they can meet them. The problem is, many of them can't understand or verify what's been put in their mind. So when the government, who sends out a signal, which they mimicked from what they witnessed in India, the aliens simply say, "Let's meet here," to people they didn't invite in the first place. They argue it seems stupid and not thought out. I would argue that these critics' reasoning is stupid and not thought out because those individuals think the aliens should reason and understand the way people on Earth do. The aliens are flying around saying to anyone, "We want to meet you." And the only one in the film so far that completely embraces their contact is Barry. Everyone they put a suggestion to has not responded to their invitation. So when the Mayflower Project discovers their call, why wouldn't the aliens respond to this? Do they really care who is meeting them, even though they tried to invite others? Do they distinguish governments? Clearly, at the end of the film, they select Roy because they specifically invited him. However, in the movie, it clearly calls the Mayflower team to be sent away with the aliens, pilgrims, plural.
Grant these pilgrims, we pray, a happy journey and peaceful days.
This was not only noted in the DVD scene menu, but it's stated in the novel that all of them went on the ship after Roy. So had Roy not been there, they would have taken them anyways. No doubt the aliens singled out Roy because he specifically responded to their call, but beyond that we know little. Some have suggested, why don't the aliens just abduct the people who they encounter, rather than invite them to some distant locale to meet? To which I would ask, why wouldn't they? Is it possible they want people to actually accept their invitation rather than force it upon them? Does Mr. Spielberg's fictional film have to conform to the standard Zeta Reticulan abduction reports? Now, one of the things about this scene is that the exact coordinates given to the government are in the area of Devil's Tower, but not at Devil's Tower, which is a small error for the film. Despite that, some complain that the aliens do not give a time to meet at said coordinates, and therefore it's another plot hole. Why? Is it possible the aliens sent another message in between scenes after the initial message? Must it be spelled out to the audience? Can we not deduce complexities like that without being shown every detail? It shouldn't in any way suspend disbelief. I always found it frustrating that folks sometimes make plot holes out of something that is in no way complicated. And don't get me wrong, I love when people tear apart terrible movies, but we have to be realistic about said plot holes. I'm an advocate for thinking during films, not just being spoon-fed plot hole details. Thus, I see Close Encounters as an excellent example of a film that doesn't do this. It expects you to think and reason. Plot holes do matter in films. However, if it's something like aliens not giving you a time on a message, well, you can use your brain to think about what might happen between scenes. A perfect example of what I'm talking about is in the film Dark Knight Rises. There are folks out there who actually think it's a plot hole when Bruce escapes his prison and gets back to Gotham. It's ludicrous to think that this innovative genius billionaire can't get back to Gotham without problems, either through contacts or secret resources. To say this is a plot hole is just silly. I'm sure there are infinitely right people out there that will say, well, if it's not in the movie, then it doesn't make sense, or that's just lazy writing. To which I would say, whatever, dude, or dudette, and suggest they watch something a little more simpler and wear their dunce hat while doing so, right, wrong, or indifferent. Thought should be a requirement for every movie in existence, and they all deserve said effort. When Jillian throws away some of her drawings, Barry sees toys and is overjoyed to see them. To get this reaction, Stephen was standing on a ladder and unwrapping a toy for the boy, and when he saw it, he couldn't hold back his excitement. Unlike Melinda Dillon, Carrie Guffey was told about everything that was going to happen, and he was not scared one bit when the kitchen was going insane thanks to the alien intrusion. In retrospect, Guffey said this about Melinda.
When she was holding me and we're doing the scene and the kitchen's going crazy and the vacuum cleaner, everything's just crazy, and she's hysterical, I'm thinking to myself, well, Steven Spielberg probably didn't pull Linda aside and tell her what's going on. So this is really funny to me. I remember thinking, maybe I should tell her that it's all just a joke.
The alien abduction is very disturbing, and after the creepy chimney scene, they try to get in the house other ways. In alternate takes, aliens did get in the house. There was footage of ETs running around the home, but Stephen cut them because he thought they didn't look good. Instead, he settled for things coming alive in the house, whether toys, vacuums, appliances, and everything else. Critics of this film cite that the vent scene is stupid because there is no way aliens could fit in this vent. Clearly, telekinesis is possible with the screws, but I never thought aliens were trying to come out of the vent in any way. Even when I was a child, I always thought it was something like the little red ball that was always seen following the other UFOs, and the same thing that was seen in the deleted scene at the end of the movie. Clearly, this ball was way too small to be filled with any living thing, so I always thought that it was like a probe or automated sensor of some kind. It is an assumption on my part. I could be very wrong, but I liken it to Star Trek, because in Star Trek, they always used probes to check out places they couldn't go. Whether that's what the intent was with the vent or not, I can't verify. I'm curious to hear about anyone's theories about this vent in the comments below. Now, in the novel, there's a very unique take that Gillian actually tried to call Roy Neary since he lived closest to her. However, I can take this or leave it. Clearly, Barry is happy his friends are here and over-enthusiastically goes to them while his mother tries to prevent it. Now, we have to cover the deleted scenes near the end of the film where the aliens are like kids touching everything. Stephen filmed the alien greys like they were children, and they acted like children, touching everything and everyone like they were new to this world. In the book, it contends that the aliens had no inhibitions whatsoever, and here is an excerpt. The visitors were feeling human groins, human faces, human backsides. If the human didn't like it, they moved on to someone who did. And if the human responded by touching them back, the humanoid visitors seemed to swoon for an instant, blinking through a dozen colors and vibrating from dark to bright. Once they realized they were among friends, the humanoids turned loose in an orgy of touching, palpating, feeling, stroking. So the implication is that the aliens are curious and childlike, and they have returned to specifically play with this human kid who wants to play with them. Kind of like E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was actually what Steven Spielberg himself attested was the sequel to this film, and stated that Close Encounters was the final edge he needed to commit to making that film.
Go up on the ship with Richard Dreyfuss in exchange for one extraterrestrial staying behind as an ambassador in good faith. And I began to think about, should I change my movie right now?
Then there are these comments from Richard Dreyfuss to further push the point.
They were meant to be like the old ones in Stranger in a Strange Land. They were meant to be beings in progress. Not children, and not a childhood. Beings in progress. And I can only say, please read Stranger in a Strange Land and you'll understand what I just said. E.T. is the sequel to Close Encounters. It's just one guy's left, bouncing around on the ground when the ship leaves. And it's really the sequel.
That's a take on it.
That was our take on it.
With these interviews giving context along with the book and deleted scenes, it is evident that these beings are not perfect and still evolving. Their actions, however, caused great trauma in Gillian and Roy, and many critics of this film state that the aliens were cruel and malevolent because of this. Now, I realize that Stephen took out the childlike deleted scenes out of the film, and because of that, I don't state a matter-of-factly that these beings have childlike mentalities. It's quite possible that these aliens don't acknowledge Barry's age and his ties to his mother. Who knows how this species propagates or their maturity process? For all we know, they appear fully mature at birth, capable of their own decisions. The point is, we have no idea how these aliens think, and to judge them as cruel or sinister is a big leap that really isn't fair. I honestly think the alien phenomenon, if proven true, has some very disturbing elements that need explaining.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
But that doesn't mean I have to apply that to this film. Certainly, I think this scene is creepy as hell and is more horror in tone, but we have to be fair to the filmmaker's intentions and acknowledge that there is a theme of innocent laced throughout this film from beginning to end, and it is on purpose. To say the opposite is just ignorant of the filmmaker's intentions. Our next scene, which was a deleted one back in the day, had Roy visiting Dax Air Force Base for a meeting. While there, Jillian is hounded by reporters about Barry, and you can see that Mrs. Neary is a bit disturbed that her husband is associating with this woman. Whether it is jealousy or just associating with this woman, I don't know. When the meeting occurs, Major Benchley does his best to debunk the people in the meeting, and his job is made very easy when the strange farmer stands up and talks about Bigfoot, thus making them all look stupid. Back to the Mayflower Project, there was a deleted scene with Robert and Laughlin very excited about some news.
David, let me tell him. I always tell him.
What are you going to say to him? You don't speak French. Salut, that it's not enough.
Laughlin would then wake Lacombe, who is listening to translation tapes. Laughlin informs Lacombe that the trucks are going to move out and that his theory was accepted by the government and they are heading to Devil's Tower. This scene was filmed on May 31st, 1976, and a funny moment occurred when Truffaut burst out laughing after Balaban couldn't figure out his French words to direct the Frenchman to put his feet off the bed on a certain mark. Instead, Balaban recalled, "I told him to get out of bed and put his feet on a mark on the ceiling." This would then proceed right into the theatrical cut where the team is preparing to relocate to Devil's Tower. Now we come to the final night for the Neary family, and it started out with a deleted scene that really made Dreyfuss's character less sympathetic, and honestly, I think it was very important for Ronnie's character so the audience could better sympathize to her point of view and should have remained in the film. Up to this point, Ronnie has not really been supportive of her husband, and it's easy to deduce her character is just a terrible wife. However, it's a little more complex than that, as it takes two to tango, and this film shows this. In the deleted scene before dinner, Toby is sent to tell his father to come eat, and Roy does not even pay attention to the boy. He stands there for some time repeating himself to his father, who is in another world, and even the boy shows exasperation.
Daddy, are you listening to me? Daddy? Daddy?
Now when we get to the dinner table, notice Brad is the only one shot in frame with his father, who earlier tried to stand with his father about believing in him. However, the other two kids are by Ronnie, apart from their father. The performance Sean Bishop did here was perfect in response to his father's breakdown. To achieve this, the young boy thought about his dog that had just died and could cry on cue. At this point, everyone in the family realizes Roy Neary is losing it, and even the kids can see it without their mother's input. You can notice that Ronnie is not yelling at her husband or agitating the situation. Instead, she sits there saying nothing even though she has a condemning look on her face. Later that night, Roy is crying in the shower and Ronnie loses it. This is compounded when Brad comes to the door yelling at his father that he's
Come on, you guys.
Just so there is no confusion, it is Roy who Brad is talking to and not his mother, as the novel verifies this. The book clearly states that Brad's words were directed at his father, so at this moment, Brad is the last one to reject his father's current behavior, and this is the moment that Ronnie is at her wit's end. She unleashes her fury on her kids and Roy. Her husband is obsessed with no job and seemingly no care for the stability of their family. It only takes a push for her to leave this situation altogether. Then, the next morning occurs. Roy wakes up and his daughter overtly asks him,
Are you going to yell at me?
You have to feel bad for these kids, and this must have smacked Neary into awareness. He begins tearing down pictures and UFO material. This scene is very relevant because as he does this, you will notice he uncovers a Pinocchio music box that is playing Wish Upon a Star. This should immediately remind you of the beginning of the film, where he was trying to convince his family to see Pinocchio, but they rejected his idea, and after the decision was made, his wife calls him Jiminy Cricket in a mocking fashion.
Hey, honey. Jiminy Cricket.
Like the movie, they now will not see his current vision of UFOs. Now, if Roy walks away from his obsession, he will spend the rest of his life wondering what all this means. Or he will pursue his search until he boards the ship and flies away, where we see his vision and we hear the music Wish Upon a Star. The parallels cannot be missed. When he pulls the top of the tower off, Roy loses it. We next see him throwing dirt into his house and he is acting crazed. Not only is Ronnie confused and disturbed by his actions, but the kids can clearly see his obsession as well. You can also see how dangerous Roy is when he is digging dirt from the wheelbarrow. While he's getting dirt, he is inches away from ramming a shovel into his son's hands. Roy is crazed, and the wise thing for any parent in this situation would be to get the kids away from him. Could Ronnie have been better supportive throughout the movie? Well, yes, but like a child, Roy is consumed by this and he can't step back to see his own responsibilities. As I said before, most of the time it takes two to tango. However, in the end, Ronnie makes the right decision by getting away from Roy. After all, the man is destroying their home and acting like a maniac, despite the fact that a subliminal drive is causing him to do so. It's a harsh but realistic take of life, and I adore that. On a final note pertaining to the Neary family, I really feel for the character of Brad, a boy who tried to support his father and always sat by him or stood beside him during the film. I should point out, during the yard scene, Brad stands aloof from his father in several scenes, seemingly lost, and then the kids are taken away from Roy. I would like to think Roy comes back from his journey someday. However, that is an optimistic take, and chances are by the time he would come back, Brad would have spent years without his father. It would no doubt affect this boy, like the other kids, seriously. It shows true damage caused to children due to divorce, and Spielberg had intimate knowledge of this himself. Kids are often the true victims of such failed relationships, right, wrong, or indifferent, and I always had a sympathetic view to Brad, especially since he was closest to his father in this film. Now, something in the novel that I really appreciated was a letter Roy wrote to his kids before he went to Devil's Tower. This is what the letter said. Dear kids, I'll be away for a while. If I come back, when I come back, I'll have some story to tell. I have to do this. I have to find out, and this is the only way to do it. Boys, help your mother. You're good, reliable boys. None of this means much to you, even less to your mother, but it's like the song Jiminy Cricket sings. Did I ever take you to Pinocchio? I can't remember if we... Everybody has a secret wish. I can't explain it. All I can say is that it's stronger than anything else when you wish upon a star. Love, Dad. During the driving scene where Dreyfuss is going down the road, he could barely see and had trouble just staying on the road since he didn't wear contacts and could not wear his glasses. Cameraman Nick McLean was so nervous about being on the hood of the moving car while Dreyfuss was driving that he asked about getting harnesses to secure him to the car more safely. Now, there was extended scenes when Roy arrived to the evacuation center, and one involved a surprise cameo by Carl Weathers. Carl played a military man who sees Roy looking towards the area being evacuated and tries to steer him away from said area. Of course, Carl could intimidate anyone, so Roy heads back to his car, and it is then he would hear Jillian calling for him and find her. The chemistry between Jillian and Roy is perfect, and both of them are in sync with each other up until the last scenes of the film. Of course, we know she remains behind for Barry while he moves on. I had zero problems believing this embrace because these two share extraordinary circumstances that few could relate to, and they are focused on a singular goal to reach the mountain. During the scene where Gillian and Dreyfus drive through barbed wire, there were 3 takes with stunt drivers. On the 3rd take, there was a serious incident where one of the crewmen was grabbed by some of the barbed wire as the car drove by. He was dragged a short bit before the vehicle stopped. Luckily, he wore a leather jacket and was miraculously unhurt. Another deleted scene after they broke through the fence was Roy stopping in the middle of nowhere to fill up the car while choppers flew overhead and spotted them. Roy would leave money at the tank, and this explained how the military set up the blockade to nab the fearless adventurers. All the animals at Devil's Tower were tranquilized by a veterinarian, and the cameras couldn't roll until all the animals were asleep. Sometimes animals would twitch during shots, causing retakes. At the roadblock, listen very closely to when the man inspects the birds in the car. You can definitely hear something being sprayed at that moment to knock out the birds. During the wonderful meeting with Lacombe, Laughlin, Roy Neary, and Lance Henriksen, Robert, in the background, you might be wondering what was said by Laughlin and Lacombe in French. Well, after Roy asks, "Who are you people?" this is the translation. "I think he knows. Yes, yes, he knows." Then, after more questions, Roy asks if searching for answers is crazy, to which Lacombe states, "I say put him on the helicopter with the rest. I'll talk with Major Walsh. Maybe we should check his credibility first." Finally, to avoid copyright, Lacombe responds, "No, I trust my intuition. These people were picked randomly. There could have been others. They're nobody special. They just found themselves in the right place at the right time." Lacombe is yet another character Spielberg stated retained his youthful outlook like Barry, Gillian, and Roy. Thus he can see what's going on with these people, but his attempt to convince Major Wild Bill Walsh does not go well. What's wonderful is when Lacombe sees the group running from the copter, he is silently cheering for them and has no desire to announce their escape. A thing to note is that while they are running by the barrels, Melinda Dillon was running with a sprained ankle, but you can't tell because of the effort she was putting into the scene. There are some commentators of this film that state the EZ4 scene lacks believability because the actual dosage of the compound could not be controlled properly to ensure that it was administered correctly. Thus, Larry could suffer an overdose or not affected at all based on wind, distance of the copter from the ground, and other components which I don't know about. I am completely ignorant about such compounds, but I wanted to mention it for thoroughness' sake, and if you have answers or thoughts on this, please note them in the comments, as I've always been curious about this. Truthfully, the mothership rising behind the mountain is kind of silly, but it looks great and is a memorable shot. As you know, in most of my videos, I don't really go into a lot of the special effects as that's not my specialty. However, I will note that the effects are just incredible, and they did a great job, and it hasn't dated that much at all. Like the music in the film, the visual effects make this movie better and believable, and without that, it wouldn't have worked. Hats off to Doug Trumbull and his team. When Roy and Gillian kiss, there are critics out there who state this is weird or morally offensive, and I'm going to lay it out real simple. Roy and Gillian are in some pretty unique situations. Her husband died, while Roy is in a relationship that is not sustainable, and there is a pretty sure bet that Ronnie will divorce him. Roy and Gillian are very in sync with each other and have magnificent chemistry. Their understanding of each other is almost on a spiritual level. As we have seen in this final act, they agree almost immediately on everything they do together. They kiss. It's that simple. It's believable, realistic, and easily less scandalous than many situations people experience today. I will not judge these characters or take offense like some moral arbiter stating it's wrong or right. I will say, considering their current circumstances at this moment in the movie, it makes complete sense. as they may never see each other again. It is what it is, and it's realistic to life. Moving on. A deleted scene that wasn't filmed completely had many of the human techs floating in the air as gravity was shifted around the mothership and everyone became 40% weightless, which involved wire work. Originally, Roy Neary would get into this zone, but Lacombe would throw him a line and bring him back to the ground. This would be followed by aliens flying around as well. You can see some of those shots here. All of this never made it into the film, though. This also brings us to scenes where aliens were moving fast. Mimes were hired to move really slow, and the film was made faster to cause them to appear frantic. However, Spielberg smartly chose not to pursue these scenes, as you couldn't match the movement correctly. And when the ship opens up, you can see Stephen's writer friends, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, who wrote Sugarland Express and polished this film, starring as pilots Captain Harry Ward Craig and Lieutenant Matthew McMichaels. Spielberg's dog, Elmer, is also seen sliding down the ramp next to Barry. To avoid the crew slipping like the dog, the cast wore rubber on their soles of their shoes. According to cast and crew, there are some famous people hidden among the returnees, including Amelia Earhart and Judge Schrader. I've never really found them, even though the making of books confirm that it's in the movie. Perhaps it's from deleted scenes that haven't been released yet. The crying scene was caused by Stephen telling Carrie that his friends were leaving forever. He thought it pertained to his friends in real life and reacted appropriately, causing everyone to also cry around him. There were other scenes with aliens opening a Coke, checking out things, and inspecting people, as I had mentioned previously. And on the day J. Allen Hynek did a cameo in the film, one of the costume aliens played with his tie and glasses and even grabbed his pipe. Although Spielberg shuns the idea of abandoning his biological children today, back then he stated this. Neary got in touch with himself. He goes into that ship knowing what he's doing. He makes the most important decision in the history of the world. There are a lot of people who judge Neary as a bad person for leaving the planet and his kids. Although I have had kids of my own and would like to say I would never leave them, I've never been in this situation. And I am sure most of those who are morally grandstanding haven't been in this situation either. I'm not going to judge this person, as that's not my style of dealing with people. I can understand why he did what he did, and that's enough. Every single person in this world has different motives, and I like films that challenge my perceptions, which this movie does in this scene perfectly. The scenes with the hand gestures at the end of the movie was a late-minute addition to the film by Stephen, as he wanted to express true communication between man and alien rather than just musical notes. The only contrast is that the puppet is tall and slim, and when it turns to walk back into the ship, the alien looks completely different because it's the original child who made the gesture before being replaced by the puppet. Spielberg noted that in the alien ship there are different races of aliens: the common greys, the one called Puck, who does the hand gesture, and finally the tall spidery alien. The film ends with John Williams' astounding theme, and in it is Wish Upon a Star, hearkening back to the messages throughout the film. It is perhaps his best score. However, Williams has always been my favorite film composer, so that makes me a bit biased to others. The film could not have been as good as it was without the score, and every scene seems to have a perfect tone. This was John Williams in his prime. This also mirrors Spielberg. Although he hadn't reached his peak success yet, Spielberg was now established as a visionary, and to see it in theaters was just astounding. Like Alien and Star Wars, the film deserves its place as iconic. What more is there to say about this true classic from a critical gaze? With the success of the film, Columbia was eager for a sequel, and for a time, Stephen seemed poised to do so.
You said the last time we were together that you would not do a sequel to Jaws. Right. Will you do a sequel to this?
Yeah, this I'll do a sequel to, because this movie is designed for sequels as opposed to Jaws, which was a once-in-a-lifetime event.
By the end of 1978, though, the idea of continuing Roy's journey seemed to fade, and instead Stephen began looking to continue a Close Encounter theme filmed that was based on a tale J. Allen Hynek told Stephen about a farm that was terrorized by aliens in Kentucky. This idea turned into a script called Night Skies by John Sayles, and if you want to know what happened with that script, we cover it in depth in our Poltergeist series. Yet Stephen wasn't fully pleased with the theatrical version of his film, and in August 1978, he asked the studio if he could recut a few scenes and add a few things, like the Gobi Desert shot. Since Close Encounters was the most successful film Columbia ever made, they one-upped Stephen and said, "We'll give you $2 million if you add a scene where the audience gets to see the inside of the ship." Although hesitant, Stephen agreed to do so, and the result was the special edition, and it arrived in theaters on August 3rd, 1980. There would be more versions to come, and we will cover them in just a minute, but first we must cover the Academy Awards. The only Academy Award winner for this film was Vilmos Zsigmond, and honestly, the way he was discarded and treated seemed to be vindication by the cosmos. During his acceptance speech, he thanked America, the Academy, and his school teachers. He did not even mention the director or producers of this film. With all of the pressure I experienced, I didn't feel like I had to thank the producers or Spielberg. Why should I give them extra when they weren't really nice to me? Later, Vilmos was stunned his award was the only one that won for Close Encounters, and felt that if he knew that before, maybe he would have changed his speech. Of course, Julia Phillips would bad-talk Vilmos like she did everyone else, and stated she tried to get the other cinematographers credit in an attempt to let the world know how he sandbagged us. The legacy of this film influenced Visitors from Another World skits for years in popular culture, and by November 15th, 1981, a television version added new scenes to the film before the film finally arrived on VHS in 1988 without widescreen. The Laserdisc would have some minor changes in 1990, but the definitive version was the 1998 DVD Collector's Edition. As the film faded, so did people that were involved with the film. One most relevant was studio head David Begelman, who would easily recover from his fraudulent crimes and find himself president of MGM. However, his life did not end well, and after years of credits like Mr. Mom, Weekend at Bernie's, and the Fabulous Baker Boys, he found himself bankrupt, and in the 90s he would commit suicide. He always stated Close Encounters was his greatest achievement. Another person tied to this film that we covered earlier was Julia Phillips, and after smearing everyone she knew in her book, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again, her career was over in Hollywood.
What is this black magic thing? This is something that no one's heard about.
There's plenty of black magic. I'm beginning to think it works, given who I know who are practitioners.
She would suffer cancer in the late 90s, and before she died in January 2002, she reached out to many people in an attempt to mend broken relationships. Many were quoted to be from the Close Encounters team. Close Encounters is listed as the 64th greatest film of all time by the American Film Institute, and it represents the vision of a childhood dream that came to fruition by a man who embraced his youthful outlook. Stephen cut no corners on this one, and the budget or studio be damned. It's the reason why it's such a magnificent film. These were the days that Steven Spielberg was a true visionary, and he would continue this march of quality in the 80s and 90s until he transitioned into a more adult and grim-imaged outlook towards film. I often long for the old Spielberg, but with audience craving films like Silence of the Lambs, Seven, and a trend of dark visions, I understand his change. I am a great fan of some of his later films, but mostly refer to his old films and his cathartic outlook of the 70s and 80s. Truly, when he retires finally, Close Encounters will be one of the films he will be most remembered for. For that, I am thankful. Well, that just wraps it up for this video. Video? I mean video. If you made it to this 2-hour and 15-minute point, I salute you, and I am so thankful for you. And if you want to one-up that, I invite you to check out our Patreon, where you can see videos a week early. And with that said, we appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next time. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Super thanks really helps, and so does sharing. And please leave a comment in the video, as it helps the algorithm suggest the video.